All right, good afternoon, class. Checking back in. This is John. We didn't quite get through all the comments that I'd hoped to get through this morning, or actually early this afternoon in class. So I wanted to take a moment to do that. And you'll notice I'm going to go back. I'm going to sort of revisit some of my brief comments and definitions, just for those of you who may have had some gaps in your notes. I won't redo this, though. This was just sort of a rehash of some of the things that we've been covering in class thus far, this first unit of the roots of global inequality. Here's a statement that'll serve as our daily objective. And the first topic we talked about was mercantilism. And the definition that I gave, and of course you can pause this and freshen up your definition if you need to. I'm just going to read through it once, and then I'll just say some brief things about the topics, although I won't say much about these first few since I spoke about them a little bit in class. So mercantilism is an economic theory that promotes government regulation of international trade to generate wealth and strengthen national power. The nation's government and merchants work together to reduce the trade deficit and create a surplus, which in turn funds the military and national growth. So I'll leave that there. Moving on to colonialism, the definition that I put forth in class was, in the mercantilist system, colonies or colonialism supplies the mother country with wealth. For example, the American colony of Jamestown provided tobacco and other valuable cash crops like indigo to British merchants, who in turn then used that wealth from tobacco and indigo to enrich the British nation. And I mentioned in class that this ultimately created a lot of the hardship, not all of it, but a lot of the hardship between the English colonists and the British Crown. British colonists and British Crown. Okay. So capitalism, the definition that I introduced in class, was essentially a replacement to the mercantilist economic theory that really comes into place in the 18th and 19th centuries. And the fundamental differences between the mercantilist system before it and the capitalist system after it is that capitalism usually operates with minimal government intervention. It relies on markets to set prices, and markets are sort of a simple balance of supply and demand. So if I am selling something, I have a certain supply of it, and if the demand that people have for my good outpaces my supply, I can probably charge a higher price. And if the demand is lower than what I have, than what I am supplying, I'm probably going to have to charge a lower price just to get rid of my inventory. Okay, so this is one of the ways. So price replaces regulation or government policy, and it's motivated by profits, not by accumulating the wealth of, say silver and gold bullion. It's sort of individual profit that motivates it, and it stresses generally free trade as opposed to tariffs and protectionism, which were key aspects of the mercantilist system. So this starts to burst onto the scene really in the late 1700s and through the 1800s, which are a period of industrialization, which is also witnessing the birth of nation states over sort of the old kingdoms of Europe. Okay, we left off with industrialization today, and I was talking about industrialization is the process by which an economy is transformed from an agricultural base to one of manufacturing. Individual labor or manual labor is replaced by mechanized production, and craftsmen, like artisans, people who know how to make a shoe, are replaced by assembly lines. Generally, industrialization occurs in the core, but it relies on the periphery of the mercantilist system to obtain its natural resources that in turn allow the factories to produce and turn natural resources into widgets, which can be sold as manufactured goods. Okay, and then what this means is industrialization is taking off during the 1800s, and countries or nation states in the West are getting quite a bit wealthier than the colonies, largely because the industrial system allows capitalists to make more money. They're essentially charging more money for the finished goods, actually quite a bit more money, than they are paying for the materials, the raw materials or the natural resources that are coming to these factories from the periphery or from the colonies. Okay, so that's a central piece in this larger story of inequality. All right, imperialism. Imperialism is a policy or ideology of extending a nation's rule over foreign nations, often by military force or by gaining political and economic control of those other areas. It's the end of my definition there. So imperialism, you have a map here. This shows how during the 1800s, Western nation states, largely in Europe, were engaging in a scramble for Africa. So Africa becomes a platform upon which much of Western imperialism takes place. And so countries like France, Great Britain, Germany, Italy are all seeking to lay claim to different parts of Africa. And part of this is tied to that earlier system of mercantilism turned capitalism and the processes of colonialism and industrialization, because these Western states are looking for resource bases where they can extract natural resources to feed their growing industrialization back home. And it's also worth noting they're engaged in quite a bit of rivalry with each other. And there's a fear, if you're in France, that if you don't grab part of Africa, your neighbor Germany will, and vice versa. So this becomes a pretty critical part. Anti-colonialism, historically speaking, anti-colonialism refers to the struggles of people in the periphery against the imperial rule of their mother country, or the core, mostly during the 19th and 20th centuries. Here there's a picture of the famous independence advocate, Mahatma Gandhi. He is one of the most important anti-colonial advocates in the history of the modern world. And it's interesting to note, he's dressed here in very traditional South Asian garb, and he used that intentionally because he wanted to call attention to the traditional origins of the Indian people as a way of motivating them through a sense of traditional pride to stand up to the British Empire. And in 1947, his efforts will finally bear fruit. And sadly, Gandhi will not live very long thereafter. He'll be assassinated shortly after Indian independence. But this push of anti-colonialism, and it's not confined to India, it exists in places in Latin America, places in Africa. It becomes a large push to sort of try to reduce the power and influence and the inequality that the Western world has at the expense of the developing countries within the world of largely the 20th century. So that's our anti-colonialism. Another important geographic flow is communism, and interestingly enough, while we don't often attach this word to the West, meaning European nation states, the United States and Canada, The founding father of communism, the founding writer, Karl Marx, and his dear friend Friedrich Engels were Germans themselves. So in many respects, communism does begin in Germany. And it's in the mid-1800s that they begin to write essentially a critique or a criticism of the excesses of capitalism. So communism, for a definition, is a system where property is viewed as public in nature, and the government takes from and gives to all members of society according to their needs. A rough example of a communist system is the country of Cuba today, where the government controls most sectors of the economy and distributes most economic benefits like money, healthcare, and food to the people. So this is quite different from capitalism, where capitalism relies on markets to determine price and, balance between supply and demand. In a communist system, there needs to be a separate mechanism for determining distribution. And that mechanism is oftentimes a central government. It's a little complicated because Marx and Engels didn't necessarily envision government coming from an autocratic state, but that's most often how communism has found expression in the world today. So countries like China that have a communist party that makes the decisions governing the economy, governing policy, governing people and expression and so on and so forth. We're seeing that play out in Hong Kong right before our eyes at this moment. But communism is a European export. It comes from Europe, and in many cases it results from some of the perceived excesses of capitalism. In fact, Marx famously predicted, or he prophesied that the excesses of capitalism would carry within them the undoing of the capitalist system, and the workers would rise up and overthrow their harsh treatment under the capitalist system. Pardon me. And then finally, nationalism. And for a definition, nationalism is a worldview or ideology that says that some groups of humans, such as ethnic groups or nations, should be free to rule themselves. Nationalists generally think that the best way to make this happen and to avoid control or oppression by a group from another group is for each group to have their own state. And this gives rise to the term nation-state, because a nation-state actually is two things. It's a group of people who share a common history, a nation. They share probably religion, share language, share customs and traditions and historical experiences. But then the state of the nation-state are the political boundaries that circle and give border and definition to that group of people. And so a nation-state would be a nation of people, a common ethnic or common group, a group bound by a common experience that are also that have a shared state boundary or political boundary. And that isn't always the case, of course. And just for an example, in Germany in the 1930s, Adolf Hitler was fanning the flames of nationalism within Germany by trying to get Germanic people, as he described them, who lived in the neighboring states, places like Czechoslovakia or Poland, to enlarge Germany's borders to encompass the nation, the German nation of people. He called it the Third Reich of people. So he was trying to get the state of Germany to expand to better encompass the nation of who he said were the Germanic peoples. All right, so with that, I will stop.